So a friend of mine asked me a kind of a tricky question. Hakan, this friend of mine, sent a part file, as you can see, and the question basically is, well, I have to go directly to these curves, and I have to impose tangency across these boundaries, right? I'm not overbuilding it. And the initial surface is a three-sided surface. Let me hide this through curve mesh down here. That looks like that, right? And even though it has its input is a point, three sides, this edge or that end is infinitely short, right? Because all of the control points are now basically on top of one another right at that point. And so then he ended up trimming that corner out and then putting in a new surface, and complexity and so on and so forth. So all sorts of other stuff is going off. Let me go ahead and go into a darker background, and causing him a bit of grief. So the question is, how do I build a better version of that? So I'm just going to go ahead and hide a bunch of stuff. Now, part of it is, this is a spline. Okay, so if I go in here and say I want to look at the control polygon of that, you'll note that that is a very simple spline, very common. If I go and want to look at the control polygon of this guy, nothing. Why? Because this is a line and this is an arc. Okay, so if I go and pick the arc and say control polygon, see, nothing. There's nothing there. Line and an arc. So the resultant is, when I create my through curve mesh, something very, very complex, especially at this point where I go from the line and an arc, there's a break, so there's a lot of additional math that needs to be built in that area. So then that affects the quality of the final surface. Now, I'm not saying don't do it. There are instances where you will build across a boundary like that, and it's totally fine. But for a super high quality Class A surface where highlights are critical, whatever, you may not want to. So we'll check out various means to build these things without, or build that surface without having that little squiggle in there. Now, for those of us that have a Mach 3 license, okay, or any license with the Studio, Shape Design Studio, you can use the Studio Surface. Okay, Studio Surface is a great tool, and it does allow you to specify, I want this curve, and I'm just going to say tangent to this face. Next, cross curves, I want this curve, and there's no imposition of tangency in that direction, so I get something that looks, we'll say, interesting. Next, as I'm going to pick this curve, and this is going to be tangent to there, and you'll note I get this shape. The reason why I get that shape is because this has to go all the way down here. Right, this goes all the way over here. Now, if I analyze this shape, let's give it a quick once around, you'll note that it is a far simpler shape than the prior shape that we had in the original example. Go turn that on, and you'll note that there is a difference in the shape of the surfaces as well. Now, a lot of times this may be acceptable. You draw a curve in there and you split it out and you put it in a little patch. Now, personally, I'm not a huge fan of that. So what I like to do is, if I can, I'm going to put in a plane at this endpoint. And, excuse me, I'm going to trim this curve. What's my bounding object is this plane. What's the region I want to keep is that. So now when I go in there, now this could be a surface, this could be a point, this could be something. You're just trimming this curve back, that input back. Go back into my Studio Surface, number 1, tangent, curves. That guy. Okay, it's already looking better. And add another one there. And select OK to create my surface. So I already have what I would call a much better surface. Okay, cleaner and a bit more, say, rational in the looks department. Now, as I look at this, you'll see that, okay, wait, why does my curve, why do my control points look the way they look? So if I look at the actual curve itself, control points, the polygon, you'll note that there's a bit of difference. And I've talked a little bit about this in prior videos. So if I double click on this surface and I'm going by parameter, if I say arc length, what'll change? Okay, now it goes super complex. I don't necessarily like that. We'll go back to parameter. Let me try switching strings. And oh, look at that. I get something far more interesting. All right, maybe a little simpler. The reason why this is because this string is now driving the math of the surface, the primary string. So by using this is a primary, and this is a cross string, I get even a more simple, clean surface. Okay? And that makes me happy. Now, if I look at the control polygon of this once again, you'll see they align perfectly. So that's another takeaway from this is when you're going through, make sure your primary strings, these guys here, are again most likely primarily driving the overall math of the surface. Okay, the guides as well, they impart their shape as well. I'm not saying they don't. Right, there's my control polygons, but it's going to be heavily weighted towards your primary. Now, the next thing I'm going to do behind this and show the parent. So now I've got this little ball up the front. Okay, how am I going to go ahead and close this out? So this is where a lot of people have issues. This is where they get confused. Right? I can use a through curve mesh once again. Right? I can come in here and say, all right, I'm going to take, let me go ahead and hide this curve, tangent, go to this point, and it's just G0, there's no tangency there to be had. Cross strings, this guy, and another one, cross string, that guy. Okay, so now face number 1, first cross string, generate that surface. I'm going to select OK. And let me look at the control points on this guy. Once again, we have a very complex looking surface. And what's basically happening is there, you can see as everything is getting crowded down towards that point. Okay, now if I look at the original, once again, you'll see that there is some major differences. Now, let's do this. Let me look at some highlight lines on these guys. Looks pretty good. Okay, across my boundary, you can see that there's a shift in that shape. Let me go to this guy. Okay, let me do this. Through curve mesh. Turn everything off. And then same thing with this one. So you'll note this is applied. Actually, let me do this. Whoops. So this is applied to the original through curve mesh. Now I'm going to deselect it and select the studio surface. And then that through curve mesh, you can see there are big differences. Now on that through curve mesh, you can see where that squiggle is at. Okay, Let me just do that to that guy. You can see where that squiggle is at. Remember, it's doing that thing that it needs to do down here. So it's putting in that squiggle. Now, if I don't have that in there, if I go and say, all right, I want studio surface and this guy, I still have a little bit of a squiggle. It's tangency, but it's not as harsh. Okay, I could mess around with the surface a little bit and adjust things to get things maybe get a little cleaner. The issue now is along this boundary. Okay, it's along this boundary. It doesn't look so hot. The reason why is because, as you can see, the surface comes up and dives down. Okay, now because it goes up and dives down, when we get down here, it gives us that little bit of, we'll call it badness. Okay, now let me go ahead and hide this guy again. Let me double click on it. Now, is there a way to clean this up? Boy, there sure is. Okay, now one way to clean this up, let me go ahead to before here. Go like this. So one thing you can do, and again, I'm a big fan of stuff like this, is just because it allows you to control what that surface looks like. Now I'm going to go and do a bridge. I want to go from this point, and I'm just going to say tangent, because that's all we want, to an object, this object right over here. So I'll go back this way. I'm going to reverse that. Now I'll go back to my studio surface, see what it looks like, right? It's going up and around, so let me double click on that. So there's my guide string. Let me add another one. Put that in there. Select OK, and boy, does that look a lot better. Now when I look at this guy, okay, now let's look at some highlights. Looks pretty good across here. Even if I foreshorten it, it looks much better across here. Again, that's just G1. It's not even G2. But the issue, again, comes down here. Okay? And this is always and forever going to be that issue when you're building to something like this. When you're building to that point for that through curve mesh, it's always and forever going to do something a little weird like that. Okay? Now, what I like to do in instances like this is go in. Now, if I'll play around with isoparametric curves, for example. I'm going to put an isoparametric curve on that surface. Let me go point on face. Let me go U and V. So as you can see, right, this runs up to this point. So it's acting almost as a rotation, which is not what we want. We really don't want that. Okay, so I'll just go back to U, hit apply, and then let's see here. We had one. It's mine, it's mine, it's mine. Go like this. Let me offset a datum. So back to his original point. Let me take this guy, offset that up 25. A little bit more. Let me intersect this to here. Okay, so now what I'm doing is I have the UV line that I want to use. Let me bring this down a little bit. That UV line is the, we'll call it the natural curvature of that surface. And let me just split it out. Trim. And actually I want to keep these and deselect that. Boy, I do love that, I'm not going to lie. And then this back. So this is, right now I got to fill this little area in. Let me go ahead and hide these curves. And just hide. To fill that area in, again, I can use several tools. Now, this is just for the example here, because I know someone's going to ask me about it. There's a tool called Fill Surface. And fill is pretty nice because it allows me to say, oh, wait a minute, I want this at G1. It changes to G1 because I'm attaching to surfaces. It'll automatically go to G1. And then the moment I pick a curve, it will just do G0 because there's no surface there adjacent, so it doesn't do anything. Now, let me look at the complexity of this surface. Let me see how complex this is. Okay, so you'll note that it builds a fairly complex surface because, right, it's an odd spot. Once again, I'll go into highlights, and I do have a what I would call a slightly better result than the prior example, and that's because I have this surface going in there with better, we'll say better control polygon. Okay. Now, I'll hide that. Let me hide this. I can also go in here and say, all right, well, and I'm doing this as an example because I know someone's going to ask. This isn't exactly what I would do. I'll come back to that in a minute. So now, I'll try out, we'll say Studio Surface. So pick section number 1, section number 2. And this is G0, this is good. Cross strings, cross string number 1, cross string number 2, and this is tangent down here. So this is now good. Let me look at the control polygon on this. A lot simpler, okay? So this does a fairly nice, clean. Go to highlights, see what the highlights look. Boy, those look nice. Okay, looks really good. Okay, now that's another tool that you can use to fill in that little hole. Now again, personally, I like to, call me a creature of extremes. How about that? Let me extract a body. Turn off that through curve mesh. Let me go back to my datum plane. What I like to do, this is just me, is rather than put in a little patch over here, excuse me, what I like to do at this point would, let me just do my trim sheet. Just run it all the way across. Okay, just run it all the way across. Remove that whole lower area. I personally don't like that whole lower. Now when I go in there and put in my Studio Surface, look at that. This lines up almost perfectly already. Oops. Okay, so it's still, kind of complex. It's going to be that. Why? Because this surface is, kind of complex. It just is. So that's just the nature of it. But highlights on it. Not too shabby. Now, if I come in here and say, all right, well, across guide number 2, I want this to be curvature. And then across, right, this is section number 1, say curvature. Saying it can't do that because this is a line. Okay, so we'll go back to tangency, not a problem. I can go curvature in this direction. I can go curvature up here for this one as well. Now, you'll note that it is starting to break a little bit. Okay, and again, I expect to see that kind of thing because remember, this is just a line. I can't impose curvature over here. So there are some odd things happening. I'm imposing curvature down this way. So a lot of times that extra one is something that I will remove. And I do, again, expect to see 100% to see this sort of little tangent break because this is a line going into an arc. There is no continuity there other than tangent. Cannot be G2, right? Because an arc is a true radius and a line has no radius. They cannot share a curvature across that point. So this is as good as that's going to get. But the rest of it looks pretty good. Okay? The rest of it, I'd say, looks pretty nice. Now, let's go back to this guy. Extract the body again. And look at those highlights once again. Right? You no longer have that. What you have is that. That versus that. Big difference. Okay? And with that, let me go ahead and hide that. Let me go ahead and hide that. Bring that back. Again, I can play with those inputs a little bit to get something a little different and continue to massage things. Okay, maybe I needed to take this and extrude this out and impose tangency, or maybe that's not necessary, right? I try not to do things that are unnecessary. This bridge curve was necessary. The nice thing about this bridge curve is I can come in and begin manipulating this to change the shape of everything that I need to in this area. Okay. Now, if somebody doesn't like this, there are other methods that you can go about building this as well. So let me go ahead and hide this. And I know this is running on a bit long, but you guys asked, I'm going to give it to you. So I'll go back to my datum plane here. And then I'm going to go do an again, I can, it depends on where you want the, we'll call it the little indiscretions of the surfaces, okay? So again, I like to take and figure out, okay, does it matter if this looks perfect? Does it matter if this looks perfect? This is just another way to go about doing this. This is just another concept or an idea. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an intersection curve from here to here. I'm going to do a point set to here. I'm going to do another bridge from here to here. Okay, that looks nice. Or what you can do if you really want to, you can just split the curve here, and drive this up. And you'll see what I'm getting to here in a minute. And building this in the opposite direction. Again, it depends on where the good stuff needs to go and where the bad stuff needs to go. Notice how close that is already. Okay, I'll come in here, pick you. Whoops. Stop. Select my face, this guy. And then pick this guy. Select OK. And then now if I check this guy out, all right. Let me double click on here. Make sure, okay, let me get my bridge curve. Did I? Yeah, that's G1. Okay, good. So, all right, we have that method, right? And we can go about building in this direction. Now, This is another thing that I have done in the past because I wasn't getting quite the surfaces that I wanted. I'm not going to go into it right now. Now, if somebody makes it this far and says, yeah, I want to see it, then I'll do it. But, at this point, it would be to take and draw in a cutout this way. But that's only if you guys make it this far. Anyway, so those are some concepts. There's another way to do it. There's always a different way to do it. And what's best is what gives you the best result in this case.